Hello, this video is the first of possibly two about the trans debate. I'm going to use as my jumping off point a bit of a tussle that's going on in the Scottish National Party. But before you chaps in the USA and before you chaps in the USA and in Australia click off this because you think it might not be anything to do with you, no, hang on. And this will set the scene for a video I'm doing next. I'm just splitting it up because it's really a big subject and I don't want to be misunderstood, and it's too long for just one video. So, first of all, let's see. First of all, I'm not even going to try to monetize this video on YouTube. There's just no point. I'd be surprised if they actually don't take it off YouTube. So watch it while you can. And certainly monetizing it would do no good, or the next one. So the only thing I've got left is you and your liking and your subscribing and your sharing to keep my numbers up. And secondly, I'm not really sure how this video is going to pan out. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to make two. I don't know if a third will be necessary. As I said, it's a big subject. So this whole trans thing was triggered, as I said, by some political manoeuvring in the Scottish National Party. And it started when a senior Scottish politician called Joanna Cherry was sacked by the SNP First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Now, Nicola Sturgeon said that Joanna Cherry was being transphobic. She didn't actually use those words, but she implied she was. And this whole thing about being transphobic sort of interests me because it's a bit weird. I mean, there are various sorts of trans people. There are the trans people who just get dressed up as a hobby, you know, and they live most of their lives as perfectly ordinary men. They just dress up like some men mess around with golf or, you know, electric trains or that sort of thing. And then there are, of course, the trans people who are men and go through operations to actually completely resemble women. And generally speaking, those, and there are the sort who don't change their external gender, but they live as women anyway. And generally speaking, those three groups tend to be as unassuming as it's possible to be. They don't want to be marked out. When they become women, they want to be women and they want to be accepted as women. And very often, for instance, the ones who change gender, who change sex, they move so that they're known as women, and they tend to be generally quiet and they just want to fit in. But then there's another group that's very noisy, very obstreperous and, well, rather extreme and extravagant in their behaviour. And it's these people that Joanna Cherry was talking about, and the fact that Nicola Sturgeon could say that that's why she was being sacked struck me as very odd. I mean, as I said, we all know that Joanna Cherry was sacked because Nicola Sturgeon didn't want her around. But it struck me as odd that Sturgeon had chosen that particular reason. It's hardly as if, for instance, there's a huge constituency of trans people in either in the SNP or in Scotland as a whole. It's not a huge voting base she has there. And in fact, the SNP has a huge voting base from Muslim supporters, and that's not a group traditionally associated with tolerant ideas to gender parity. So this is why the video is going to be divided into two. And in this first video, I'm going to cover my belief that much of this trans business comes from this small section of men, that little group in the middle, the noisy ones, and they're a section of men who actually hate women. Now, We know historically that there's always been a set of men who really loathe, hate and despise women. In previous times, they found a place for themselves in the church, for instance, and secluded themselves in monasteries, or depending on where they were in the world, in some other religious order, or became hermits and just stayed away from humanity altogether. And in general, as I said, they stayed out of the way of women, a condition which was obviously mutually satisfactory to both. The problem arose when they got into positions of power and occasionally made themselves dangerous by ensuring laws were passed that put women at a disadvantage or punished them for being women in some way. One of the best examples is our very own King James, the 6th of Scotland and the 1st of England, who became obsessed with witches and witchcraft. He even wrote a book on witches. It was called Daemonology or Demonology. And he made sure that women were pursued the length and breadth of the British Isles for this imaginary crime. And he appointed, or had appointed, a number of sadistic women haters who went to extraordinary lengths to target and torture many thousands of women in the time that they were given that power. I want to point out that although witch hunting is often associated with the Middle Ages, the most deadly and hysterical times were actually started in the 17th century. It famously leaked over into North America, by the way, but I think that was for a slightly different reason. So, anyway, back to Britain. During the second half of the 17th century in particular, there was a positive nationwide hysteria about witchcraft. And a witch finder, for instance, called Matthew Hopkins, became very rich from charging towns and villages for his services in ridding them of witches. And he was personally responsible for the deaths of maybe more than 300 women. By the way, burning wasn't the death penalty for witches. They were hanged. Sometimes they were drowned, but that was more or less by accident, you see, because what happened? Ordinary women were drowned and witches were hanged, because what happened was one of the tests was to tie a woman's hands and feet together and throw her in a pond. If she sank, she was a normal woman and she was all right. Of course, she drowned. If she floated, then it meant that even the water didn't want her and she was a witch, and so she was hanged. Sort of heads I win, tails you lose type of situation. This witch stuff did die down after a while, but the male-dominated legal system, and again, I'm not angry with men, it's just that's the way it was. And it still hung on to some of its misogyny. For instance, in the 18th century, the penalty for forgery was hanging for a man. For a woman, the penalty for forgery was being burnt at the stake. That's a horrendous death. And okay, I well understand that given the times when coining it had to be a capital offence because nearly everything was a capital offence. I mean, stealing handkerchiefs was a capital offence, but coining forgery was a big problem because you could compromise the financial integrity of an entire country with too much forged money. But why the horrific death of burning for women? That would have to be a hangover from the idea that a woman engaged in criminality was not only a criminal, but a pollutant. You burn pollutants, don't you? Anyway, that aside, as I said, in many cases, in previous generations, men who hated women could either join a conquering army and spend a lot of time slaughtering them, or he could join a monastic order and spend most of his time writing about how pernicious they were, and the rest of his time praying very hard for God to stop him from having all these weird fantasies he was having. But nowadays, that's not so easy. Well, in the West, at any rate. If you join an army, you have all these irritating rules about not massacring people, and religion isn't much of a refuge for anyone anymore. So how does the man who has a psychological disturbance in this case manifesting itself as a hatred of women, how does he take out his fury on the female sex? Well, what better way than to parody women by dressing up in really weird, caricaturish, caricaturish makeup and funny dresses, or by physically assaulting women in any chance he gets. And frequently that's in the area of sports, or making women feel uncomfortable in, like, I once remember making a video. Yeah, all right. I remember making a video once about, I think my dog can feel that I'm getting upset, so he's coming here to comfort me. I was in a motorway service station, and I went to the lavatory, and there was a person there who was standing in the middle of the other women who were all, going in and out of the cubicles and washing their hands and that sort of thing. And there's no doubt about that, was standing there, and he was wearing women's clothes and was messing around, had his skirt up and was messing around with his suspender belt and his stocking tops. Oh, that's a garter belt to Americans. And, no woman wears stockings and suspenders on a long car journey, when she's got tights or trousers or whatever. It was quite obvious that this was his parody of femininity. But if I'd have had a little girl with me, I'd have been very concerned, because he was sort of fiddling around with those stockings and looking round at all the women. And it was a nasty experience. Anyway, but it seemed to me that he was doing... Sounded like he'd been sick just then. No, you're all right. It seemed to me that it was an exerting of power there. Anyway, and it was an assault. There was no doubt about it, but we were all too well-mannered to say anything. I have to stop and reiterate that I don't hate men. I've been married very comfortably for a very long time, and I have 3 fine sons whom I love dearly. I don't hate men. That doesn't mean to say I'm not aware that there are some men with what you might call socialization problems. So back to the trans issue. When I first saw a male athlete dressed vaguely as a female competing in a sport against women, I thought, how could you even believe you'd won anything? When he won, because of course he did win, how could he think he had in any ways conquered anything? But then I don't think that was the point. It wasn't that this male as female athlete would feel pride at being the best in sport. It was him feeling pride in having a chance to show women who's boss. He had a chance in a sort of proxy way to beat them up. He had affirmed his own idea of male superiority, which came from a deeply flawed personality or a psychological disturbance, one or the other. Remember, I'm talking about a particular sort of trans man. I'm not going to call them trans women, because they're not women. And it is this sort of man about which Joanna Cherry is campaigning. But for reasons of her own, Nicola Sturgeon is calling her, or implying that she is, a transphobe, and is using that to expel her from the party for intolerance of the other. It's just an excuse, of course. Cherry is being sacked for challenging Sturgeon's control of the party. Meanwhile, the trans issue is one that you're getting in the USA as well. I'm not too sure about Australia, but I'm quite sure it must be there too. Perhaps you will leave a comment and let me know. But we also have to consider why politicians are going for this issue with such enthusiasm. Now, I have my own ideas, and I'm going to deal with that in the other video. I just wanted to get out of the way my theory that this part of the trans thing is from men who hate women. and they have a psychological problem there, and we shouldn't be humouring them in this psychological problem. For sure they can get away from women somewhere, they should find their own ways, but they shouldn't be allowed to do it by offending, insulting and intimidating women. And I think Jerry was saying that, and that I'll be dealing with the rest of it in the next video. Meanwhile, I can give you a clue about what's coming up in the next video, to say that the trans issue has very little to do with minority rights, and it has everything to do, sorry, I've got a cough, with social control and the wish of politicians to make people, force people to accept big lies in the service of smaller lies. It doesn't harm also that if 50% of the population feels intimidated, well, that's 50% that they have a bit more control over. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo, with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com, and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.